Yes and no. So the reality is that Muslim women for many centuries have been putting conditions in their marriage contracts and having pretty good luck with that in the courts, depending on what it is they do in the contract and how carefully and tightly it's worded, right? For the most part, the thinkers that I look at here are very unfavorable to various kinds of conditions in marriage contracts, specifically the ones that women always want, right? Not taking any other wives, not taking any concubines, not relocating me from my hometown. And there's no condition a woman can put in to protect herself from the possibility of talaq, right? She might be able to stipulate it at a particular point in the future, but she also might not. There might be things that would happen in the interim that would lead to her losing that right. So these jurists were really mostly not in favor of those kinds of conditions. The Hanbalis were much stricter about allowing these conditions and allowing women to adjudicate on the basis of them. The other thing is that conditions about, second wives or moving away from home or things like that were conditions which wouldn't actually prevent the husband from taking a second wife. If he contracted another marriage, it would be valid. The only thing that she could do is if she put in conditional divorce, if that happens, then she could get the divorce, right? But that was a sort of automatic thing based on his power of divorce rather than anything else. So yes, people do find ways to put conditions in marriage contracts, but the fact is that it's not a panacea, at least for these legal thinkers, because to their mind, I mean, Imam Shafi'i on the question of barring against future spouses through a condition in the marriage contract says she can't do that. She'd be narrowing what God made wide for him.
Yes, I was curious about the practice of arranged marriages and versus by the parents or the father, as you mentioned, versus other ways.
Sure. In the 9th century, fathers were perfectly at liberty to arrange marriages for their minor children of both sexes, right, boys and girls, as well as potentially, there was dispute about this, never married adult women. Okay. Once a woman had been married, then she absolutely could not be married off without her consent in the future. And once a boy had arrived at a particular age, she also could not be married off. He also could not be married off. Rather, he had to do his own marriage or give a proxy to someone else. As far as the question of how this works today, virtually every contemporary Muslim majority society has raised the age of majority and has done away with compulsory marriage. That is to say, has taken away from fathers the right to marry off their children without their consent. There are still social pressures in many places that lead to coerced marriages. It happens even sometimes in countries in the West. The question of coercion and consent is a very complicated one because law is certainly not the only factor. And this is a big debate actually in feminist legal theory. And I don't mean Muslim feminist legal theory, I mean Western feminist legal theory about sort of what social circumstances are so overwhelmingly coercive as to constitute non-consent to all kinds of things, right? As far as just arranged marriages in general, I think particularly among more educated classes, what one typically sees is facilitated marriages, right? Yeah. Which is a slightly different thing. But actually, I suspect that Sayyida Reshma has more to say on the subject than I would about arranged marriages and coerced marriages. You probably have your finger on the pulse of that, at least in the US, a little more.
Well, I think it is culturally relevant, and there's a lot of social pressures applied, and many people don't really realize that, among Muslims even, that really it's not permissible to coerce a woman to get married against her will.
Yeah. Does that answer your question?
So you said in your speech something about being perturbed So you said in your talk something about being perturbed about the analogies that have led to some of the scholarly rulings. For me, when I heard about the sort of unilateral right to divorce, I didn't really need to look at why. Just looking at the sort of circumstances in which that would be very oppressive to women, like in cases of domestic violence, like that's perturbing. So, what do you suggest for how to kind of address those situations in a modern context where we're basically relying on American law to protect us? Because for some women, the Sharia law, as it is, without the presence of judges who can kind of take them out of that situation, which I guess in the early period of Islamic law, the Islamic judges could help with in situations of that. When that doesn't exist, we're kind of left with nothing but the secular law.
Yeah.
Do you want to say something about this as well?
Well, I mean, in the theory of domestic violence here, which is kind of a contradiction to the way marriage is discussed, forcing a wife to have sexual relations, for example, is considered abuse. Whereas I think in Islamic, theological discussions, that's just the way it's supposed to be.
Well, yes and no. So marital rape, which by the way wasn't a crime in all the American states until sometime in the 1990s, right?
Yeah.
It doesn't compute as a category because rape is a property crime, right? Which can't be committed by the husband because this sexual access is licit. That doesn't mean he's necessarily entitled to have sex with her forcibly. The Hanafis allow for it, although they tend to dislike it. But other jurists, in fact, say, no, this isn't permissible. If she refuses him, he can withhold support or do these other things, right? So the discourse about it is sort of troubled by the fact that people are confusing a lot of levels of discussion, right? They're confusing a level of kind of, is this permissible, is this ethical, with a level of what's the legal category that we attach to it? Do we call it rape? Well, if what we mean by rape, and this was the British Muslim thinker or scholar who said this, oh, there's no such thing as marital rape in Islam. Well, I sort of felt sympathetic for him because I knew what he meant, which was to say this is a legal category that doesn't sit comfortably here. But on the other hand, what he needs to be saying is this is totally unacceptable behavior, and leave aside the issues of definition. Forced sex is not okay under any circumstances for all of these particular reasons. As far as your question about secular law now versus what Muslim judges did back in the day, the kind of institution that most of them talk about and that most of the legal works talk about in the case of an abused wife is actually not a necessarily judicial intervention or the pronouncement of divorce, although Maliki jurists, in fact, you have a broad category of harm, which is grounds for judicial divorce. But usually, that you send them to live with trustworthy neighbors, right? There's a huge reliance in these texts on a sort of notion of a self-policing community, and the assumption that other people are going to intervene to stop bad things from happening. And part of the issue, and this would have been an issue also in cities in Cairo in the 20th century and the 19th century, it might have been an issue in quarters in Ottoman Aleppo, is that some of the things that are formulated in the early period, some of the institutions for making sure that women are essentially safe, no longer exist. And so once you bring the state in, and it's not just the issue of the American state, it's also the modern Pakistani nation state, or the modern Egyptian state, or the modern Syrian state, you're talking about a fundamentally different way of approaching the question of law and its relation to people's lives. So I don't know if that entirely answers your question, but
Well, just adding a note on domestic violence issues, insofar as the example of the Prophet is a source of law, then the Prophet behaved in a very respectable, cordial manner with his wives and with women in general. It's not always, I think, brought in as strongly as it could be, but that should be a strong argument made from in terms of defining, I think, family law for modern day.
Right. The issue, of course, is then once you bring in a particular precedent, then there are other issues like concubinage and other things, and polygamy for that matter, that then come up. And if it was listed for the Prophet, then what are we going to do about it today? Which is, I sort of hesitate to bring this up rather than ending on this very lovely note about the beauty of the prophetic example. But I think these are hard questions, and we need to come up with, and this is what the jurists were doing, even though some of their answers are ones I don't agree with. We need to come up with consistent and thoughtful ways of addressing the range of things that are in our authoritative precedents. Thank you.
Okay, so in Islamic law, if the husband passes away, then what happens to the daughter as far as getting married to someone? Like, does the mother choose for her?
Well, probably if you're talking about today, probably she chooses for herself, which would be the case if her father were alive or not. In the 9th century, it depends very much on her age. Under some rules, the Hanafis allowed mothers to contract marriages for their daughters as well as for their sons. Other schools didn't, but there the grandfather would step in, or the girl's brothers if they were of age, or uncles, plenty of people around to do that. Or if none of them were suitable, she could go to a judge. That's who would contract the marriage. As far as who would choose, I think it's also important to note that even as there is this paternal power to contract marriages, to the extent that particularly among the elite there was a certain level of gender segregation, women were in a position to go and do the visits, to actually do the networking, to arrange the marriages. So, on the one hand, we kind of have this paternal power. On the other hand, the influence rests with the women. Right?
I'm not familiar with Islam, and I think it applies to all religions, but I did hear Dr. Nifat Hafiz Barzanji talk about domestic violence and other issues, and she said that it would be much better if more women were interpreting the Quran and other religious texts, and I wonder what you thought about that.
I think that's a great idea. I do think, I like that you said the Quran and other religious texts, because I think that part of a kind of lack of depth in some contemporary Muslim discussions is results from not reading broadly in the interpretive literature and other kinds of important texts. Of course, the Quran is absolutely central. Of course, people need to interpret it. Of course, Muslims of all kinds, both genders, all walks of life need to be engaged in that reading and that discussion. But there's a lot of richness also elsewhere that needs to be brought into the discussion.
Right, and also on that point, about the Quran and other religious texts. With the nature of globalization today, it's simply impossible to do a study of Islam without looking at what's going on with the other religions, especially with the sort of opportunistic way a lot of people use religious history. Like you were saying, people don't realize that up until fairly recently, the woman pledged to obey and the husband to cherish. So there's a kind of political correctness of the right, in which people have sort of an idealized version of, say, Western history or Christian history. And then this becomes kind of a pressure that's projected upon the Muslim, where there has to be cooperation between people looking at the Quran critically, people looking at the Bible critically, other texts critically, and having a broader view.
Absolutely.